There is a miscalculation that the narcissistic structure makes, consistently, predictably, and with a precision that reveals more about the architecture of narcissism than almost any other behavioral pattern Jung documented. It is not a mistake born of stupidity. It is not a mistake born of inattention. It is a mistake born of structure, of the specific way the narcissistic psychological architecture processes information about the people in its environment, and of what that architecture is fundamentally incapable of understanding. The mistake is this. The narcissistic structure encounters the empath's kindness and reads it as weakness. Not metaphorically, not approximately. With a degree of certainty that shapes every subsequent decision the narcissistic structure makes about how to engage with the empath, how much pressure to apply, how much projection to deposit, how far the boundaries can be pushed, how available the empath's psychological resources will ultimately prove to be. The kindness in the narcissistic structure's reading is an open door, an invitation. Evidence that the empath's psychological system lacks the internal architecture to refuse what is asked of it. That the gentleness, the warmth, the genuine care that the empath brings to the relationship is the expression of a psyche that cannot protect itself, cannot draw limits, cannot organize itself around anything other than the needs of whoever is present. This reading is wrong. Jung documented with extraordinary precision why it is wrong, and why the narcissistic structure is structurally incapable of arriving at the correct reading until it is too late. Until the empath's kindness, misread as weakness for so long, reveals itself to be something the narcissistic structure has never encountered before. Strength that never needed to announce itself. Sovereignty that wore the face of warmth. A self so complete, so internally resourced, so genuinely present to its own depths, that its kindness was never the expression of an open door. It was the expression of a person who was so fully inhabited that they could afford to be generous. And the narcissistic structure, encountering this, finally irrevocably too late, encounters the most disorienting thing it has ever faced. The realization that it misread everything from the beginning. To understand why the narcissistic structure makes this specific mistake, why it reads kindness as weakness with such consistency and such certainty, we have to begin with what the narcissistic structure actually knows about kindness. Jung observed that every psychological structure develops its understanding of human behavior through the lens of its own interior architecture. The narcissistic structure's interior architecture is organized around one fundamental principle. Psychological resources are scarce, and the only way to secure them is to extract them from external sources. This is not a conscious belief. It is a structural orientation, built into the foundation of the narcissistic psyche through early experiences that convinced it, at a level below conscious reasoning, that genuine care is not freely given, that warmth is not unconditional, that kindness always has a cost, and that the only question worth asking about any apparent generosity is, what does this person want in return? From inside this architecture, kindness is never simply kindness. It is always a transaction, always a position of vulnerability, because to be kind is to want something from the person you are kind to need their approval, their reciprocation, their continued presence, to be organized around their response. The narcissistic structure does not give kindness freely. It cannot. Every expression of warmth or generosity it produces is calculated, consciously or unconsciously, to generate a specific return. Admiration, compliance, the activation of the other person's caregiving instincts, the installation of debt. And because the narcissistic structure only knows kindness as transaction, it reads the empath's kindness through the same lens. The empath is kind. Therefore the empath wants something. Therefore the empath needs something. Therefore the empath is organized around securing something from the narcissist. And this organization, this need, this orientation toward the narcissist's response, is the weakness the narcissistic structure believes it has identified. Jung called this the projection of psychological structure. The narcissistic structure does not see the empath as they are. It sees the empath through the lens of what the narcissistic structure itself would be, if it were behaving the same way. And in the narcissistic structure, kindness is always the behavior of someone who is not yet getting what they need. What the narcissistic structure cannot perceive, what its entire psychological architecture is organized in a way that makes perception of this specific reality impossible, is the distinction between compulsive kindness and sovereign kindness. Jung documented this distinction with care, because it is the distinction that explains everything about why the narcissistic structure's misreading is not merely wrong, but categorically, architecturally wrong. Compulsive kindness is what the narcissistic structure's model of kindness is based on. It is the kindness of the pre-individuated empath, the warmth and generosity that flows from an unconscious compulsion to maintain connection, to regulate another's distress, to organize the self around the needs of whoever is present. This kindness is genuine in its feeling but unconscious in its motivation. The empath who gives it is not choosing to give it. They are compelled to give it by the specific psychological structure that organized itself, through the experiences of early life, around the belief that love requires caregiving and that connection requires the dissolution of the self. This kindness, Jung observed, does carry vulnerability within it. Not the vulnerability the narcissistic structure imagines, not the weakness of someone who can be exploited, but the genuine vulnerability of a psyche that has not yet established the clear internal boundary between self and other that makes it possible to be kind without being consumed. The pre-individuated empath can be depleted by their own kindness, can lose themselves in it, can find after years of giving from this compulsive place that the giving has left them less whole rather than more. This is the kindness the narcissistic structure has learned to read accurately. And having learned to read it, the narcissistic structure generalizes. It assumes that all kindness is this kindness, that all warmth is this warmth, that every empath it encounters is operating from the same compulsive, boundary-lacking, self-organizing around others psychological structure. This generalization is the fatal error, because there is another kindness entirely. Jung called it sovereign kindness. The kindness of the individuated empath, the warmth and generosity that flows not from compulsion, but from genuine abundance, from a psyche so fully inhabited, so completely in possession of its own resources, so deeply rooted in its own internal center, that it can give without being depleted, can be warm without being consumed, can care without organizing the self around the object of that care. This kindness does not come from need. It comes from fullness. And it is completely invisible to the narcissistic structure's detection systems. Because the narcissistic structure's detection systems were calibrated to identify compulsion, not abundance. Need, not sovereignty. The open door of a psyche that cannot protect itself. Not the chosen openness of a psyche that is so secure it has nothing to protect against. The individuated empath is kind, and the narcissistic structure reads this kindness through its only available lens, the lens of compulsion and transaction, and the vulnerability it has always associated with warmth, and arrives at a conclusion that feels certain and is entirely wrong. What happens next is what Jung found most significant about this particular dynamic. The narcissistic structure, having misread the empath's kindness as weakness, acts on that misreading. It begins to push, not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently, gradually, with the specific quality of incremental pressure that the narcissistic structure applies when it believes it has identified an available resource. The projection increases. The demands on the empath's caregiving increase. The behavioral scripts designed to activate compulsive response, the vulnerability that triggers rescuing, the rage that triggers managing, the coldness that triggers pursuing, are deployed with increasing confidence. Because the narcissistic structure is certain it has read the situation correctly. The empath is kind. The kindness is weakness. And weakness, in the narcissistic structure's experience, yields. It always has. Every previous empath the narcissistic structure encountered, every person whose kindness it misread as weakness, eventually yielded, eventually absorbed, eventually organized their inner world around the narcissist's needs in exactly the way the narcissistic structure's misreading predicted they would. So the narcissistic structure pushes, and something unexpected happens. The empath remains kind, not in spite of the pressure, not by suppressing a response, not by white-knuckling their way through the urge to yield. The empath remains kind because the kindness was never compulsion in the first place. The pressure finds no lever to pull. The behavioral scripts designed to activate compulsive response find no compulsion available. The specific psychological hooks that have always worked, have worked on every previous person whose kindness was misread as weakness, find nothing to attach to. The empath continues to be warm, continues to be genuine, continues to be present with a quality of care that the narcissistic structure can observe but cannot explain within its existing framework. Because within the narcissistic structure's framework, this is impossible. A person who is being pushed and who does not yield is not kind. They are defended. They are cold. They are performing kindness as a strategy. But the empath is not performing. And this, the reality of a kindness that does not yield under pressure, that does not reveal compulsion beneath its warmth, that continues to be genuinely itself regardless of what is deployed against it, is the first indication the narcissistic structure receives that its reading was wrong. Jung documented the specific moment when the narcissistic structure begins to suspect its misreading. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no confrontation, no revelation, no sudden clarity. It is a quieter moment than that. It is the moment when the narcissistic structure realizes that the pressure is not working. Not that the empath is resisting the pressure. Not that the empath is fighting back or establishing limits or articulating what they will and will not accept. Simply, that the pressure is producing no yield. The empath is still there, still warm, still genuine, still kind in a way that the narcissistic structure cannot locate the compulsion beneath, cannot find the transaction inside, cannot identify the need that the kindness is organized around securing. And the narcissistic structure encountering this begins, slowly, uncomfortably, with the specific quality of cognitive dissonance that arises when a deeply held structural assumption encounters evidence that contradicts it, to recalibrate. Not consciously, not through a deliberate process of self-examination, but through the accumulation of disconfirming evidence. The kindness that was supposed to be weakness keeps not being weakness. The warmth that was supposed to be the expression of need keeps not being organized around any need the narcissistic structure can identify or exploit. The empath who was supposed to yield keeps not yielding, not because they are defended or cold or strategically withholding, but because there is simply nothing in their psychological architecture that corresponds to the yielding the narcissistic structure was expecting to produce. Jung called this the beginning of the narcissistic structure's genuine encounter with the differentiated empath. Not the encounter it expected, the encounter with someone whose kindness would eventually reveal its compulsive core. The encounter with someone whose kindness has no compulsive core. Someone who is kind because they are whole. And someone who is whole in a way that the narcissistic structure has no category for. What does the narcissistic structure do with this realization? Jung documented 3 possible responses, and understanding them is essential for the empath who is in this dynamic, or who has been in it, and who is trying to understand what happened when the narcissistic structure finally, belatedly, encountered the reality it had misread. The first response is escalation. The narcissistic structure, encountering the failure of its initial pressure, increases the intensity of the pressure. If the first level of projection did not produce yield, perhaps a greater projection will. If the first deployment of vulnerability did not activate the caregiving response, perhaps a more extreme display of apparent need will. This escalation is the narcissistic structure's attempt to find, at higher intensity, the compulsion it was certain was present at lower intensity. Jung observed that this escalation typically produces nothing, because the absence of compulsion in the empath is not a matter of threshold. There is no level of pressure that will produce yield in a psyche that is not organized around yielding. The empath's sovereign kindness is not suppressed compulsion waiting to be released. It is genuine sovereignty. And genuine sovereignty does not have a breaking point at which it collapses into the compulsive structure the narcissistic structure was expecting. The escalation finds nothing. The second response is confusion. When escalation fails to produce the expected result, the narcissistic structure enters a state that Jung described as genuine psychological disorientation. The model it has been using to navigate the relationship, the model in which kindness equals weakness equals available resource, has failed to produce its predicted outputs at every level of intensity. The narcissistic structure does not know what to do with this information. It cannot revise its model, because the model is not a conscious belief that can be updated through evidence. It is a structural orientation, built into the foundation of the narcissistic psyche, that processes all incoming information through the same lens regardless of what the evidence suggests. So the narcissistic structure holds two contradictory perceptions simultaneously. The empath is kind, and the empath does not yield. Within the narcissistic framework, these two perceptions are logically incompatible. Kindness yields, that is what kindness is. And yet, the empath is kind, and the empath does not yield. This paradox produces the confusion, and the confusion, Jung observed, is one of the clearest indicators that the narcissistic structure is beginning to encounter something its architecture cannot process. The third response, and the one that Jung found most psychologically significant, is rage. Not the ordinary rage of someone who is frustrated or disappointed. The specific rage of a structure that has discovered it was wrong about something it was certain about. The narcissistic structure was certain the empath's kindness was weakness. It organized its entire engagement with the empath around this certainty. It made decisions, deployed strategies, invested significant psychological energy in an approach based entirely on a misreading that it never questioned. And now it is confronted with evidence that the misreading was wrong. The empath was not weak. The kindness was not compulsion. The door the narcissistic structure thought it had identified was never open. And the rage this discovery produces is not directed at the empath for being strong. It is directed at the empath for having been, all along, something other than what the narcissistic structure was certain it had correctly identified. For having been, in the most precise psychological sense, not readable. For having existed beyond the narcissistic structure's categories. For having been, in the end, genuinely other. Jung was deeply interested in what this rage reveals about the narcissistic structure. Because the rage, in its specific quality and its particular intensity, in the specific grievance it expresses, is the most honest thing the narcissistic structure produces in the entire dynamic. More honest than the idealization. More honest than the vulnerability. More honest than any of the behavioral scripts deployed throughout the relationship. Because the rage at the empath's undiscovered sovereignty is the narcissistic structure's closest encounter with its own shadow. The shadow of the narcissistic structure is not, as is sometimes assumed, cruelty or manipulation or the capacity for harm. The shadow is the knowledge of the void. The awareness kept below consciousness at enormous psychological cost, that the internal emptiness that the external regulation was constructed to fill is real, is present, and is not going away. The empath's sovereign kindness, the warmth that came from fullness, the care that came from genuine internal abundance, the presence that required nothing from the narcissist in return, holds up a mirror to this void. Because it demonstrates through its very existence what a psychology organized around internal resources, rather than external extraction looks like. It demonstrates what the narcissistic structure does not have. Not as accusation, not as judgment, simply as demonstration. The empath's fullness in the presence of the narcissistic structure's emptiness is the most confronting mirror the narcissistic structure has ever faced. More confronting than anger, which can be projected outward. More confronting than rejection, which can be reframed. More confronting than the empath's silence or departure or transformation. Because the empath's sovereign kindness does not give the narcissistic structure anything to push against, project onto, or reorganize its defenses around. It simply is. Warm, genuine, unhurried, unbothered, present to itself. And in being that, it asks the narcissistic structure the question that the narcissistic structure has organized its entire existence to avoid being asked. What would it mean to be that whole? For the empath who has been inside a dynamic with a narcissistic structure, understanding this mechanism changes something. Not about the harm. The harm was real. The years of pressure, the accumulated weight of projection, the specific exhaustion of being in a relationship where the genuine care one brought was consistently misread and exploited. None of this is diminished by understanding the mechanism behind it. But something changes in the quality of the understanding. The narcissistic structure did not misread the empath's kindness because the empath was presenting something confusing or ambiguous. It misread it because it was structurally incapable of reading it correctly. The narcissistic structure's psychology was organized at its foundation around a model of human interaction that had no category for sovereign kindness. That knew compulsion and transaction and the vulnerability of need, and encountered genuine abundance and had no lens through which to perceive it accurately. This does not excuse what the misreading produced. The behavior that followed from the misreading, the increasing pressure, the exploitation of what was believed to be weakness, the escalation when the weakness refused to manifest, caused real harm regardless of the mechanism behind it. But it places the harm in a different frame. The empath was not misread because they were weak. They were misread because they were beyond the narcissistic structure's capacity to accurately perceive. The kindness was not exploited because it was exploitable. It was targeted because it was the most visible expression of a quality, genuine internal abundance, sovereign warmth, that the narcissistic structure had never encountered in a form it could recognize. Jung called this the empath's psychological visibility problem. The very qualities that make the differentiated empath who they are, the genuine care, the authentic warmth, the willingness to be present with another person's experience without requiring the transaction that the narcissistic structure always expects. These qualities are precisely the ones that the narcissistic structure's misreading machine was built to misidentify. The empath's greatest strengths looked to the narcissistic structure like its most exploitable vulnerabilities. And this, Jung observed, is not a flaw in the empath. It is a limitation in the narcissistic structure's capacity for genuine perception. There is a moment in the dynamic, and most empaths who have been in a relationship with a narcissistic structure will recognize this moment when it is named, when the empath realizes that their kindness has been consistently misread. Not just once, not just in a single interaction, but systematically, persistently across the entire duration of the relationship. Every act of genuine care was read as compulsion. Every expression of warmth was read as need. Every instance of choosing to be present fully, genuinely, without transaction, was read as the behavior of someone who could not choose otherwise. The empath's sovereignty was invisible, because the narcissistic structure has no category for a sovereignty that expresses itself through warmth rather than through coldness, through presence rather than through distance, through the full, genuine, unboundaried-looking expression of care that is, in reality, the most deeply boundaried thing the empath is capable of, because it comes not from compulsion, but from choice. This moment of recognition, the understanding that the kindness was never weakness, that the warmth was never compulsion, that the sovereignty was always present even when it was invisible to the only person in the relationship who was evaluating it, is, Jung observed, one of the most significant moments in the empath's individuation process. Not because it produces vindication, not because it resolves the harm or retroactively explains what happened in a way that makes it less painful, but because it is the moment when the empath understands, perhaps for the first time, what they actually are. Not what the narcissistic structure told them they were. Not what the years of systematic misreading accumulated into a narrative about. What they actually are. Someone whose kindness was never weakness. Someone whose warmth was never compulsion. Someone whose care was always, even when it was targeted as though it were a vulnerability, the expression of a psychological abundance that the narcissistic structure could not contain. could not exploit fully, and could not prevent from eventually, irreversibly, reclaiming itself. Jung returned in his work on these dynamics to a question that he found both practically important and philosophically profound. What does the empath do with the understanding that their kindness was misread? Not just in this relationship. In every relationship where the sovereign warmth they carry was perceived as exploitable softness. In every dynamic where the genuine care they brought was mistaken for the compulsive caregiving of someone who could not refuse. The answer Jung arrived at is not tactical. It is not about developing harder edges, projecting greater coldness, learning to make the sovereignty visible in ways the narcissistic structure can recognize. It is about acceptance. Acceptance of a specific difficult reality. The differentiated empath's kindness will sometimes be misread. Not always, not by everyone, but by psychological structures organized around the specific misreading the narcissistic structure performs. Structures that can only read kindness as compulsion, warmth as need, genuine care as the behavior of someone without sufficient internal resources to choose otherwise. The misreading will occur. And the empath cannot prevent it by becoming less kind. Cannot prevent it by making the sovereignty less warm, less genuine, less fully expressed. Because the kindness is not a vulnerability. It is not a presentation that can be modified to close the gap the narcissistic structure believes it has identified. It is who the empath is. And who the empath is will always be, to some psychological structures, illegible. Not because the empath is failing to communicate clearly, but because some psychological structures are not capable of reading what the empath is communicating. Jung called this acceptance the final frontier of differentiation. Not the acceptance of harm, not the resignation to being misread and exploited without limit. The acceptance of the specific form of visibility and invisibility that comes with being the kind of person the differentiated empath is. Visible in their kindness, invisible in their sovereignty, and willing finally to inhabit both. Not for the narcissist. Not to manage the narcissistic structure's misreading or educated about what it failed to perceive. For themselves. Because the empath who has completed this arc of understanding knows something that took the entire relationship, and perhaps the entire individuation process it catalyzed, to arrive at. The kindness was never the problem. It was always the point. What the narcissist ultimately fears about the empath's kindness is not the kindness itself. It is what the kindness implies. That there is a form of psychological organization the narcissistic structure has never achieved, and has always been oriented toward extracting from outside. The internal abundance, the genuine self-possession, the relationship with the self, that makes it possible to be warm without being depleted and present without being consumed. The empath's kindness in its sovereign form is evidence of everything the narcissistic structure lacks. Not as accusation, not as judgment. As simple present ongoing demonstration. The warmth is real. The care is real. The genuine interest in the other person's experience. Even when that other person is a narcissistic structure that has been systematically exploiting the warmth and misreading the care, is real. And it comes from a place the narcissistic structure has spent its entire existence trying to locate outside itself. This is the final, deepest reason the narcissistic structure fears the empath's kindness. Not because it was weakness. Because it was always unmistakably the opposite. The living presence of a psychology that found, through whatever path it took, however painful the individuation process that produced it, the one thing the narcissistic structure has organized its entire existence around: the desperate, compulsive, ultimately futile project of extracting from the world. Enough. The empath in their sovereign kindness had enough. Had always had enough. And the narcissistic structure, encountering this, finally, too late, having already deployed every mechanism available to exploit what it believed was weakness, encounters the knowledge it most feared. That what it was looking for was never available from outside. And that the person it was looking for it in was the last person it would ever be able to extract it from. Because the empath's kindness was never weakness. It was the clearest expression of the one thing the narcissistic structure could never manufacture, never extract, never maintain through any external means. Genuine wholeness. And the narcissist who feared it without knowing what they feared, who targeted it without knowing what they were targeting, who pushed against it with everything available and found it unmoved. This narcissist encountered, in the empath's sovereign kindness, the most honest mirror of their own psychology they will ever face. Not a mirror that condemns, a mirror that simply, and completely, shows what was always there, the void where the wholeness would be, if the shadow had been faced, if the individuation process had been allowed to complete, if the kindness had been recognized from the beginning for what it actually was. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark,